and thank you for joining us in an AMAA-sponsored event at the Armenian Presbyterian Church. We'd like to thank APC for allowing us to host this public lecture, and thank you, Mrs. Setan Albandian, for providing us with coffee, refreshments, and delicious snacks. We invite all of you to the reception after the lecture is done. Thank you, Mr. Berj Manushagyan, for being kind enough to drive Dr. Hilmar Kaiser from Boston and back. Dr. Hilmar Kaiser, we thank you for traveling from Yerevan to the States for being here with us today. Dr. Kaiser will highlight aspects of the relief work and its importance that go beyond the work in Aleppo, Syria. He will emphasize its Armenian character, which has been lost in discussions of missionary work and the Near East relief. In addition, his talk will deal with the Ottoman context. A little background about Dr. Kaiser. He attended Yerevan State University, Institute for Armenian Studies, and holds a Ph.D. for the European University Institute in Florence, Italy. In 1991, he was one of the first 2 Western historians on the Armenian Genocide to start research in the Ottoman archives. Between 1995 and 2005, he had been banned from the archives for his work. In his studies, he focuses on the Armenian Genocide with special reference to the German role, Ottoman perpetrators, the implementation of the atrocities, and in particular to resistance. In 2001, he published a groundbreaking study for the first time, highlighting the role of Armenians in the humanitarian resistance in Syria. In a seminal monographic study of the Diyarbakir region, he showed how provincial authorities played a dynamic role in shaping the crime. He contributed for the Oxford Handbook of Genocide Studies the entry on the Armenian Genocide. Most recently, he analyzed Ottoman policies in the provinces of Van and Erzurum and the decision for genocide. Dr. Kaiser, we are looking forward to hearing your expertise and research through this public lecture. Before we begin, Padre Gala Bedian will start us off with a prayer.
Welcome, and let's pray. Let us bow our heads in prayer. Father, we thank you that you have given us the desire for justice and the desire to find out truth in history. And you have seen the Armenian people and all that they have been through, and you have witnessed the atrocities, and yet you have witnessed resistance, you have witnessed kindness, and you have witnessed all manner of things happen around that event, that genocide that happened in 1915 through the 23. Lord, I ask that you would bless our time this evening, that you would make it informative, that our questions, that our hearing and our listening would be careful, and that it would really be an informative and wonderful time together. Սիրելի հայր, շնորհակալ ենք այս առիթին համար, որ ունենք, եւ շնորհակալ ենք, որ քու ծառաներդ մեկը, քու ուսուցիչներդ մեկը ներկայ գտնվի մեր մեջ, խնդրենք, որ օրհնես այս բահը եւ դաս մեզի ականջները լսելու եւ սիրտերը ընդունելու այն նորությունները, որ ունիս դոկտոր Քայզերի միջոցով։ Օրհնես ինքը եւ օրհնես եւ շնորհակալ ենք այս առիթին համար Հիսուս Քրիստոսի անունով գաղութենք։ Amen.
Genocide is a crime, and we should be very careful of accusing people, because the benefit of the doubt applies. So if we want to be careful not to accuse the Ottoman Turkish government of doing something they might not have done, is we have to be careful how we approach it. So let's look at the Ottoman data. Ottoman data, what is that? These are the documents from the Turkish government which were produced at the time of the genocide. And these were not just, let's say, documents, or it was data you collected for the history books or for whatever. This was what I call operational data. That means this was data produced while they were doing it, and it was data used for planning it. So this was really in a way, the DNA of the genocide. So if we assume that the Ottomans do not exaggerate the numbers of Armenians, we can, as a conservative estimate, conservative, that means a low estimate, assume that about 1,750,000 Armenians lived in the Ottoman Empire. That is a low number, okay? That is the Armenian population calculated for March 1915. Of these 1,750,000 Armenians, 1.4, 80% were dead 2 years later. 80%. Now you hear 80%, this sounds really terrible, right? So basically look around. 1, 2, 3, 4, you alive. The 4 people there are dead. 1, 2, 3, 4, you alive. All others are dead. Go through this is what it means. But this is not true, because the survival was not even. In Constantinople, you had a very high survival rate. In the core provinces of the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, the kill rate was 95% and above. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, you're alive. You're all gone. Now you say you have a 5% survival rate. But these 5%, this is again just a statistical number, it doesn't have a real meaning. Because being alive does not mean you have still 2 arms. It doesn't mean that you're mentally sane. Before the genocide, the Armenian population had a statistically 0 presence for STD, syphilis. By 1917, syphilis, typhus, tuberculosis was standard among Armenians. So it means you were most likely, as a survivor, if you were sick, you had a high probability of being maimed, and then you have a high probability of mentally in a mental disorder. Now you say, what is that Oda talking? We don't know about this. You know why you don't know about it? Because a lot of the things you know about the genocide, you know from survivor stories, right? But none of these people who had a mental, physical disorder would ever have been admitted into the United States. The only survivors who made it here were the A+ survivors. The others were dying in the streets of Aleppo as beggars. So what you read in these survivor memoirs is the Sunday school best case scenario of genocide survival. Reality was much worse. So what I'm just saying is, remember what I said in the beginning, I cannot really grasp it, and when I tell you this, I tell you the limitations of our sources. So you have these 95%. So what is 95%? When you say 95%, you have 5%. That's wrong. Take a glass, throw it against the wall, and then the glass bursts in so many pieces, right? Then you take one piece of the broken glass up, that is 5%. From this one piece of glass, you cannot reconstruct how the glass was before. That is, the 5% were a fraction of the Armenian community. The Armenian community wasn't reduced, it was destroyed, and you had 5% broken stones. Then what does 5% mean? Demographically, most of the men were gone. The 5% could not reproduce. Building up a community, it's not possible to create a family. There was not enough marriage material around. So this you have to think. And now if you think about Armenian organizations, they have all these age gaps. That is, even 100 years later, you still have that. Every 30 years, there is a whole group just missing, because in that bracket, nobody was born. So that is basically the genocide. In the eastern provinces, more than 95% kill rate. Ankara, 60%, and then 20 to 30% further west. And that's what I say, this is not genocide, this is much more, it's extermination. There is nothing left you can build up. Why do I say this? You know that the killing of the Muslims in Yugoslavia in Srebrenica was in 2005 recognized as a genocide, right? I'm not criticizing it, it's right. But Srebrenica, the community is devastated, but there still is a community. And whatever has happened, they have a future. In the Armenian case, there was no future. There was no way to come back. Now, this is a statistic of death. Now, where did Armenians survive? Basically, if you were deported as an Armenian, if you were sent to Mosul, there were three big areas of settlement. It was Mosul, Deir Zor, Aleppo, Jordan, Syria. Okay, these three areas. Only 10 to 15,000 Armenians ever arrived in Mosul. Everybody else sent to Mosul was killed on the way to Mosul in Diyarbakir province. So the Mosul area, whenever there were more than 7,000 to 8,000 Armenians at a time, is numerically insignificant. If you look at the central area, Deir Zor, you will find out that by late 1916, we have the document, the authorities reported no Armenians left. They didn't say killed, but then you say, okay, if there's no Armenian left, and if the Turkish government is right, they weren't killed, where did they go? Nobody was in Saudi Arabia. Mosul to the east, we know it was 7,000. Diyarbakir to the north is nobody, and we know there were 120,000 officially in Syria. That was not the guys. So somehow these people had disappeared, and of course we know where the bones are today. And then there was one area where the highest concentrations of survivors, that was in the Ottoman provinces of Aleppo and Syria, which is Damascus and today Jordan. So we have a problem. We have to explain, why did these people survive and didn't die like anybody else? And when you look at your family history, you will find out that, I would say, in 9 out of 10 cases, your ancestors, if they were deportees, that means had to leave the ancestral home, were from the provinces of Aleppo, today Syria, and Jordan. That is so why did this happen? There are two reasons. One reason which is very controversial, but I'm convinced, and I think I can prove, that the Ottoman army and some of the civil officials in Syria were against killing Armenians. They were not friends of the Armenians, you know. They were not Raphael Lemkins. They were not saviors in that sense, you know. They had Armenians executed on court-martial decisions which do not meet legal standards. So they were not really nice guys, but they were not genocidal. We have to understand there is a basic fundamental difference between a murderer, a common killer, and somebody who commits genocide. It's a different dimension. So they did a lot of bad things, but they didn't go into that dimension. And that opened a kind of sphere where something else could happen. And that's where the Protestants come in. So, who were these guys? If you look at the population statistics for 1914, I mean, there were no Armenians in Damascus, a handful. Aleppo had maybe 2,000 officially, you know? There was a handful of Armenians in the Azores, so that was really, really limited. What happened was then that a lot of Armenians were deported to these so-called settlement areas in this western area of Arabia, and among were the Protestants. And there is certain things I really don't know, but I'm thinking about it, you know. If you look at the Cilician Protestant Church, you know there were the Adana massacres of 1909, right? And you lost a whole lot of Batvelis. And these Batvelis who were murdered near Osmani, they were burned alive, they were replaced by young people. So what you had in this area was a lot of young couples where a young Batveli in his early 30s or whatever, who had married a girl who was usually a student of the Marash Theological Seminary. So the Marash Theological Seminary was not just a good theological school, where also apostolic Christians went to, but it was a pretty good marriage market. And their matchmaking worked perfectly, you know? And I mean, when you read a little bit about Hovhannes Eskidjian, and then you also find out that there was this woman called Gulenia Eskidjian, who was his wife. And I mean, she was pretty sure 50% of what he was doing. You know, that was a tough woman who had his convictions, and they were a team. So what you had there were a lot of people who were right in the middle of their life. These were wives of Batvelis who had babies on their arms, who knew what needed to be done. And it was a little bit of luck for the Armenians that Eskidjian was sent shortly before the genocide from Musadag to the small congregation in Aleppo. Then a couple of Armenians somehow missed their way on deportation and ended up in Aleppo, like Reverend Aharon Chirajian. And they were then integrated there. So what was even more important is that the governors of Aleppo, and two lost consecutively their position, they were fired, they were opposing the central government in the killing. And even there was a central government official sent to Aleppo to organize the deportation into the desert. His name was Hamid Bey. He had been at one point the governor of Diyarbakir. And later on, he was, after 1918, the deputy minister of the Interior. That was the guy who organized the court-martials, you know. So this guy was there. So the man who organized the deportation donated from his own money a considerable sum for helping the deportees. So that's not what you usually hear. The deportation guys were the killers, but that guy was exactly the opposite. So this all created an area basically where local community could do something. And on the apostolic side and also on the Protestant side, the people got together, we have to do something. And a lot of the children had been abandoned and lost in Aleppo, and so by July 1915, the first orphanage was growing. And it was done by Armenians, not by missionaries. There were no missionaries on Aleppo. The closest missionary station of the American Board for Commissioners of Foreign Missions was in Aintab. The closest German Protestant mission was either in Marash or in Ufa. Then there were other people which were very important. That was Jesse Jackson, the American consul, and Walter Rössler, the German consul, who was a very active Protestant. You had some, I mean, again, you know, you have a couple of terribly nationalist Germans there, but who were also good Protestants. So they wrote things about German nationalism. Today, I mean, my hair would get twice white, you know, but it didn't matter. They were hiding Armenians in their basement, you know. Again, so these are not clear-cut people. You don't have the angels and the devils. You have people who live real lives. On the one hand, they do something very stupid or bad. On the other hand, they do something really good other people wouldn't expect, you know. So people are not this kind of ideal types, you know. So that was Martha Koch. And then you had a Swiss Protestant, Mr. Zollinger. And so all these people came together. So what you have there is basically people who didn't really like each other because they had community infighting. You know that they're on a board and then this guy doesn't list well and then you have only one guy who can be number one. You know, the typical life, you know. But there was something where this all wasn't that important. It was, you need to do something. So what they did is, the German consul, of course, couldn't do anything, you know. So, because he was he had got orders from Berlin, and so basically he had to behave in a certain way. So what he did, he talked to the Swiss guy and said, you know, behind my consulate there is this building, that's where we put the orphanage. So, and because it was next to the German consulate, the police in the first did not know, is this a consular building where we cannot answer, or what is it? So they created these gray zones where there was ambiguity. And then the Armenians realized that what the money or the resources they could bring up locally was completely insufficient. We talk about thousands of people coming almost every day. So they understood two things. First of all, we have to document what is going on, and then we have to inform. And these reports from Aleppo then went through the American missionaries and through the Germans to Constantinople, and then Ambassador Morgenthau started alerting the US. So basically that the American missionaries and the American diplomatic service, but also the German diplomatic service, but not so much, raised the alarm. Was not that there was a terribly smart ambassador, I don't say he was stupid, but he got the material. And Armenians understood, we have to get the material to these guys. So the initiative about information fundraising abroad was an Armenian initiative. The missionaries, the diplomats came later on it and joined in. So this was the beginning of what later became Near East Relief. You have heard about that, one of the biggest humanitarian organizations at the time, and which later, after the war, transformed into the League of Nations High Commission. And today it's called United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. That started with the Protestant Armenians in Aleppo. So that's basically your history. So I mean, it sounds strange, but we can really show how this progressed. So they then started raising the alarm and money was coming in. But there was a problem then, because these American missionaries, they were also pretty racist. Because yes, we are all brothers in Christ, but you're a native brother. Native. They didn't say Negro, you know, they would use Negro for other people, but native. So there was always this kind of attribute, native. That means you're something less. And there is then correspondence, and they said, you know, now we get all that money to Aleppo, but we cannot give it really into the hand of these natives. So basically, yes, we believe in Jesus and we're all saying, but you know, we cannot really trust these Armenians, you know. And this is a little bit crazy. You have to understand the Armenians here in the US started collecting money for the deportees in Syria, right? So Armenians were sitting in a church like this on Sunday, and they were very poor people, they were not the rich guys we like today, they were bringing their cents to the Batveli, and then the Batveli was giving the money, taking from the Armenian workers, was giving it to the American board. And then the American board decided, well, the dollars we got from the Armenians, we cannot really entrust to Armenians. You get the kind of twisted thinking, okay? So, but then they understood that Eskijian was the guy who really had the information, and he was decent enough. So basically, there was then Merrill, the missionary in Aintab, wrote that Eskijian has all the data and so on. So everything we know about, from the Western sources, about the number of deportees which ended up in the consulates, was indeed done by the Armenians in Aleppo, and to a large part by Eskijian and also Shirajian. You see, suddenly, when you see these things, you understand how this very small Protestant group in Aleppo, a handful of young people, suddenly becomes the focal point of something extremely important. And they work, even today, influences us because they produce the evidence. So then German Protestants from Marash were sent to Constantinople. They met with Pete, that was the head of the American missionaries, and they decided that they should organize relief distribution outside Aleppo, Adana, the deportation routes. Then they come, and the mission was get into Deir Zor. That was their mission. So they come to Aleppo, they meet with Cemal Pasha, and Cemal Pasha said, no way you go to Deir Zor, but we have so many orphanages here which are in bad shape, you organize them. That was, of course, not the assignment, but by the decision of the Ottoman general, they had the permission to stay in Aleppo. They got the green card for Aleppo, you know? So they started the orphanage work, which was extremely important, but even more important perhaps was that they could use their legalized status to build up an organization, expand the organization, and use this as a kind of departure point for missions into Deir Zor. Now, this is also very often discussed, but what is forgotten about it is these were just two Western women. Everybody else was Armenian deportee. So the deportees, Protestant deportees, as deportees, became volunteers in humanitarian resistance. So you have to think what is going on in the mind of these people. You saw the road of deportation, you saw the atrocities, you have left your home, you come to Aleppo, you somehow get a little bit away from the edge of the knife, and then the first thing you do is not try to save your own skin. You become a volunteer where you expose yourself to even greater risk. So, and then they built up a whole network. They were deported Batvelis at Hama. The names were Reverend Kondakjian, Reverend Nohudian, and Reverend Haidostian. Kaspar Haidostian, which is the great-grand-uncle of Paul. So, Paul Haidostian. So, and I found a document in Istanbul from these guys from August 1915. We are the deported Armenians. We are now in Hama. Situation is very bad. Signed the three Batvelis, and they sent this to Talat, the Turkish minister, the Ottoman minister of the Interior. If you're an Armenian community leader in 1915, the one thing you want to do is get off the books, off the radar. And these guys, I think, are they totally nuts, sent a telegram to the chief organizers. It is basically, please don't forget us, you know. And they tell him, by the way, we are deported and we need food. I mean, I don't know if I would be so brave, you know. I mean, either they were completely nuts, which I doubt, but these guys, again, they put their own life behind the purpose they're there. And what they did is, of course, they organized, like the Protestants in Aleppo, they organized an orphanage. Kundakjan paid the highest price by picking up the orphans like Hovhannes Eskitjian. He contracted typhus, was bitten by lice, and died. Then Nuhudian took over, but he also could rely on the assistance of Armenian Protestant women who were graduates of the Marash Theological Seminary. And of course, you know, with these women, you don't mess, you know. Every Armenian husband knows that, you know. In the kitchen, it's a different territory, and you have to walk very carefully. And that was the same for these Batvelis, because these women, and I have the memoir of one of them, I mean, they wrote how things had to be done. I mean, what does a Batveli know about the needs of dozens of children, you know? That was basically when the women told them, you know, Batveli, why don't you step aside and let us do this, you know? Which means also there's a whole gender aspect in this relief work, you know? That suddenly women who were deported, and Armenian women in those days, Protestants were different, but generally, if you come from a village, it was not that different than from a Muslim family. It was a male's world, you know, and women were to follow orders, you know. And then these women get deported, and I said, now we take charge. And they did. Because at a certain point, these Batvelis refused to convert to Islam. I can later explain what was behind, and they were sent to Syria, to Jordan, to Tafillah, near Ma'an, and they were out of the picture, but then the women were there. And so what you have there is then Hama, which was a very big concentration of deportees, had its own branch. And now how do you get the money from Aleppo? In Aleppo, the money came through the German or the American consul and was handed directly to the guys there for redistribution. But how do you get the money to Hama, where you don't have a consul? Very simple. The Armenians had Muslim business friends who made sure the money would arrive. And the governor of Hama was a friend, and the military governor was a friend. So you again have these Muslims supporting them. And these Muslims, of course, officials had no interest to go on record. So it's very difficult to find this evidence, you know. But it pops up when you start scratching deep. To the south, there was a deported Batveli in Damascus, Tahmizian, who had come from Caesarea. But he couldn't do much. So you have an Ottoman governor in the general staff of an Ottoman officer in the general staff of the Fourth Army, who's a Muslim fundamentalist, who hooks up with the humanitarian resistance and warns the Germans about the massacres of their Zor, that they are planned, that they are coming, and you have to do something about it. That's usually what you don't hear, you know. In Ottoman context, this was high treason. But he was the assistant of Cemal Pasha. Now, you always hear these terrible stories about Cemal Pasha. No, he wasn't trying to kill the Armenians. Actually, an Armenian physician, Altunian, delivered his babies. And I don't go too much into those stories because they're all impressionistic, but then you get the pattern. So what you have there is, I talked earlier about the conversion, right? That Cemal Pasha had the people converting, and he had saved Sahak II Kabaria, the Catholicos of the Great House of Cilicia, from Sis. He had placed him in Jerusalem. So in August 1916, Sahak Kabaria, that was at the time of the Deir Zor massacres, writes to Istanbul, this forcible conversion of Armenians is totally unacceptable. That's not the way we do it in Syria. Central government makes a copy of the letter, send it to Jamal. By the way, we got this letter from the Catholicos, Could you explain to us what he means? Jamal gets a mental fit, sends an order to Jerusalem, to Sahak. He said, you send one of your trusted people ASAP to Damascus. I have to talk to him. So then the poor bishop, Cute, comes to Damascus, and he gets a cold shower from Jamal. And Jamal says, I approach all these questions from a purely humanitarian perspective. So now don't expect that you have the same understanding of humanitarian how he thought it, okay? So he had a certain thinking about himself acting as a humanitarian. He said, it really doesn't matter if you're a Muslim, a Gavur, means Christian, a Jew, a donkey, or a monkey. Important is to survive until the end of the war. Go tell your boss, Sahak, he should leave the people alone. It is important to survive. This statement was published in 1926 in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And Bishop Cute was not really the guy to be suspicious of genocide denial, So that's one statement. We have a similar statement from a Turkish nationalist woman, Halide Edip, which is very well known. And then I found a telegram from the governor of Damascus, where Jamal was yelling at the governor of Damascus. I said, if you don't do anything, all these people will die. It would be a deed worthy of the Middle Ages. Humanity would not look on in favor. So 3 times the same statement, which means that he was doing things other than what the document said. For example, in September 1915, an Ottoman investigator arrives in Aleppo and reports to Istanbul that 10,000 Armenians working on the railway in the Amanus Mountains. And this is completely illegal. Jamal is confronted, 10,000? I give only permission for 700. I'm completely against this. I had no idea I have to do something, Sounds terrible. If you know that the poor guy had been a week earlier at the construction sites, had seen the 10,000, and somehow his math was that bad, So basically what he was doing is he was throwing sand in the eyes of the authorities. So he knew there were 10,000. He just forgot to notice it. So there was these spaces you could fill up. And everything was okay until the summer of 1916. Until the summer of 1916, there were only 2 massacres only in the area of the Fourth Army that were near Ufa in August 1915. And these were committed from Ottoman troops coming from Diyarbakir province, which is not Fourth Army. And Jamal had these guys executed. And the accusation was plundering of deportees. And they got hanged for it. The disaster for the Armenians came when the Ottomans decided to rearrange the army areas authorities for the commanders. And their Zor left the Fourth Army area and became attached to the Sixth Army, that is the army of Iraq. Then the governor, who was working with Jamal, and who had meetings with the missionaries and so on, Ali Suad Bey, was kicked out. And then things got bad. One of the worst people of the Armenian Genocide, Zeki Bey, was declared governor. And he immediately started making trouble. On the way to Deir Zor, he ended up in Aleppo, in Hotel Baron. And he was doing everything to get the Mazlumians deported. Jamal tried to prevent it. No, they had to be deported. So what does Jamal do? He deports the Mazlumian to Zahle. That's a resort in Lebanon. So basically, put it this way, you get deported from New York to Miami Beach, okay? Couldn't be better. And if you want to know the more details about it, you can go on the website of the Shoah Foundation at the University of Southern California. There's an interview with Koko Mazloumian, who was present to all that, and he tells the story, what was going on. So he was saving the Mazloumians, but then he couldn't, but then the Fourth Army was out, the Azov was out of his control, and Zeki started rounding up the people who were doing relief work. And the people who brought money into their Azov under risk were Armenian volunteers. What was the life expectancy of an Armenian volunteer? Maximum 1 mission. 1 mission meant if you were successful, you made it into the Azov, but you never made the way out. Extremely successful ones accomplished 2 missions, and only 2 or 3 made 3 missions. Nobody survived. They all died. Anybody who became a volunteer basically committed suicide for the community. And these were people who had families and so on, and then Beatrice Rone wrote after the war the obituaries for her friends who had died. But again, there was even more going on. There were people from Aintab in the Azov who were apostolics. And in the Aintab apostolic community, there was a kind of evangelical, I don't know, I'm not a theologian, you notice it by now, but they called themselves the lovers of Christ. They went to study at the Marash Theological Seminary. One of them even went to Britain to study there. And her name was Araxia Gebegian. And they organized at the place of deportation humanitarian work in their Azov. We have Araxia's last letter when she knew she would be executed. And again, these were people, they were like brothers and sisters with the Protestants. And I mean, they wrote in German, by the way. And if you read these letters, I mean, even 100 years later, I mean, for me, it's very difficult to talk about this. I mean, if you read the stuff, you're not going to sleep that night. And to understand the extent of psychological devastation the murder of Araxia caused was the following. There were then stories starting circulating, like she was a Jeanne d'Arc. Allegedly, the governor of the killer, the mass murderer, the Cherkessian Zeki Bey, had offered her marriage to save her life, and she refused, which of course doesn't make sense. After the war, rumors spread that she had escaped and was living with a Bedouin and was evangelizing the Bedouin in the desert of Syria. So even for people like the Protestant pastor Paul Béron of Aleppo, they could not handle the fact that they had lost these people. So I mean, it is, these people have seen thousands of people die, you know, but they never recovered from this. So the few survivors who were mostly Westerners, they never recovered from what had happened. So what was then the motivation? It was not just religion. These volunteers had a program. They had a vision. You know, there was a German philosopher, Bloch, and he had the German word Vorschein, preview. That means what you do today, that it is basically of what will happen in the future. It's already impacting us today. So they had a vision beyond the genocide. And they said, survival is important, but it's not the survival of the individual. That's also why they were willing to give their life. It's the survival of the nation. Survival of the nation means you have to make terrible choices, not about your own life, but you have to let people let die, and you have to have people let live. So what they did is they made sure that they saved the young ones, because this is the next childbearing generation. They made sure that the people with a college education, the teachers, the students, would go into hiding. And these were the people the Turks wanted to kill first. So basically, what they did is, they understood the lifeboat they could have was so small, they had to allot the seats for people who would be capable to build up a new Armenian society. And remember what I told you earlier, there is no real black and white. If you have that kind of program, it sounds very good, you know, but it also means that your humanitarian resistance means you have basically to tell people you will die, and I decide this. Because you don't get the hiding place, you don't get the food, only those get the food. And these were decisions made by Batvelis. And I'm not saying that these Batvelis were bad people. What I want to say is that these Batvelis were going through internal turmoil, contradictions, challenges of conscience we cannot even assess, and we don't want to really come close to anything like that. And important is, there was no religious discrimination. The Protestant humanitarian resistance was ecumenical. They wouldn't ask if somebody, if he's Catholic, Apostolic, Protestant, or whatsoever. You know, it really didn't matter. So they had a vision of a new Armenia, and they were negating the genocidal logic. So you have to understand, you're living in a slaughterhouse, people dying left or right of you, and you don't accept this. It's that despite everything, there will be a future, and even if my chance of survival is 0, I don't give up. And that is why so many Armenians survived in Syria. It was not only that the army in that area wasn't a killing machine, it was that these people were taking together their resources and trying to maximize the survival, because at the same time in Syria was a killing famine. In Mount Lebanon, hundreds of thousands died. There was not enough food. I just got the consumer prices for World War I on Aleppo. The inflation was terrible, and I mean, deportees don't have money, you know. So for you, the inflation, it sounds terrible, but if you don't have money, 0 means 0. So these people achieved something that after World War I, there was a new Armenian beginning. And this new Armenian beginning, and that you have to understand, the people who secured the Armenian beginning after World War I, only a handful were present, still alive, to be part of that. Most of the guys who worked to secure it, and especially the women, never made it. So, and I think that is then, after this, the war was over, and then comes something really important. The Armenian Protestants emancipated themselves from the American missionaries.
Thank you very much. This was an insight to the humanitarian resistance and survival after remnants of genocide. What we would like you to do, of course, and other scholars and academicians, is to put this in writing and publish them.
We're doing that.
And continue on this type of lectures all over, things that we will certainly assist and organize wherever they are, whether here or in Armenia. This type of events, when they are organized, we have you in the focus, the public is in the focus. There's no meaning of discussing this in front of a mirror, whether it's Hilmar or myself. So you're important. And I'd like to say a few words and then open it for questions a little bit so that afterwards we'll all go and have some refreshments. When we think about that time and era after post-genocide in the Near East, there are two names that will eventually and eternally stick in the minds of both Armenians and be certainly in the history books, and they mean a lot for us. One of them is a symbol of death, destruction, darkness, grave, annihilation, and that name is Zor. And then there's another name. There's another name for life, resurrection, vitality, renaissance, rebirth, and that name is Aleppo. These are the two names in the landscape of the same city, same country called Syria, that will forever be stuck in our minds and certainly give this meaning in our future. It's very important to talk about this, individuals and well, many individuals, because we're talking about an era between the 1915, right during when the genocide started, and when the Western organized formal aid and assistance arrived, the Near East Treaty of the missionaries, which is at the end of the World War I, 1918. This era, everything that happened was individually initiated, as we heard in a lot of stories, a lot of symbols there. These were pious men. They were prepared. They went, most of them, of course, were educated. They went to school, they went to seminaries, they were filled with the love of God and the fear of God, and they risked their lives, and they lost their lives so that we survived. Many of us would not be here today had these people not saved some of the remnants of the survivors. So these are things that we should bear in mind, keep them in our focus, and make them as role models as we continue our lives and our mission.